My name is Hannibal Richards. You probably haven't heard of me. But you go back to the early part of the 19th century, and the whole of Ilfracombe would have heard of Hannibal Richards. Oh, they all knew him, knew where he could be found, knew what he did, knew what he dealt in. Hannibal Richards, but nobody said a word. I don't come from here. I come from Cornwall originally. Born somewhere down there, nobody's quite sure where, and well, I don't remember for obvious reasons, but anyway, I was born down there and grew up there, and as a young man got into what I think you call today the import and export business. And just like today, the import and export business was hard going. There was endless forms to fill in, and if you imported stuff, there was huge amounts of duty to pay on it, particularly the stuff that people liked. French brandy, French wines, ports from Portugal, sherries from Spain, tobacco from everywhere, lace from Belgium. All expensive stuff anyway. And by the time they put the duty on it, ordinary peasants like you couldn't afford it. Well, that's where my business comes in. I belong to a gang in Cornwall called the Cruel Cottagers. Cruel is important because they were a rough lot for the Cruel Cottagers. Not only did they smuggle, they wrecked ships as well. Now, whether I was any part of that, well, I'm not saying. But eventually things got a bit hot in Cornwall, so I looked for another place to operate. And I found up on this coast, just a couple of miles down, there's a place called Lee. Big hills coming down and a very secluded cave. Perfect spot for my business. So I bought a farm there. Don't know if I was much of a farmer, but I bought a farm and, well, lots of buildings there to hide stuff. And other places too. There's a trail you can find in Lee that shows quite a lot of the places where we used to store stuff and keep stuff. And what do we do with it? Well, we'd sell it to the publicans, to the public, anybody who wanted it really. And good business it was too. Not everybody had a silver pocket watch in those days, but I did. I settled down here though, no more wrecking, nothing like that. I was just an honest smuggler. That's what I did. I married a girl here called Jane Gammon, very old Ilfracombe family. Now if I stand up, you'll see I'm 6 foot plus. Jane was 5 foot. All she was. We had a child called Jane as well. And she is almost as famous as I am because Jane was the 7th person in Ilfracombe to reach 100 years of age. And our daughter, also called Jane, repeated it. She got to 106. Most unusual, isn't it? And actually, those two people were probably part of the reason we started getting so many visitors here. Ilfracombe they thought was a healthy place to be, so there you are. Even I did all right. I managed to get to 85 before I was called. Now, what would you do today? I bought some stuff with me today. Now I've rounded the prices up to the sort of thing you'd find on ye old Tesco's up on the hill there. This of course is with the duty. Brandy, £20 a bottle. Well, £12. Dearer, £10 for wine, £8 half a bottle of sherry. Does that sound about right? Ah, well. Supposing, special offer just for today, we offered you £10 for the brandy. How does that sound? What have we got? £6 for a bottle of port. Any good? Yeah. £6 for a what? Oh, falling off. Never mind. There's me Madeira there. £6 for that. How's that? Oh, I can do wine for £4. Yeah. £5. £5 for lace. How about lace, ladies? How about that? Fancy that? £5, Belgium lace. Baccy for your pipe, sir? Any offers? £4 for an ounce? You still use ounces? Oh, you're going back to ounces, aren't you? Yeah, I've heard. Yeah. No offers. Go on, you got to die of something. You may as well die of this. Oh, well. The thing about me, though, I was never caught. Never. Everybody knew me. The excise men knew where to find me. But I was never caught. How do you think I managed that? Well, I had plenty of reason for the people of Ilfracombe to keep quiet about me. Who was going to tell on me when I could offer them brandy for the equivalent of £10 a bottle, eh? Nobody. And what about the excise men? How many bottles of brandy do you reckon it takes to bribe an excise man to look the other way? So I was never caught. And just as well, because had I been caught, they'd have taken me off to Exeter Assize, and there, put on trial. And you might have seen me hanging from a rope outside Exeter jail. That didn't happen to me because of the good people of Ilfracombe. So, I hear you've been having a celebration last year. Drink the toast to your Britannic Majesty. More than I would do to mine. George IV. A fat mophead. Corrupt. Liar. Libertine. I mean, who would have a leader like that, eh? So, I won't drink the health to my leader or to yours. Would any of you in contraband liquor? I drink to the good people of Ilfracombe who kept their silence. So I lived till I was 85. Cheers all. Cheers. Cheers.
Introduce myself. My name is Margaret Burfitt. As you might notice on your programmes, I lived a little bit later than a lot of the people you'll see today. In fact, what I'm notable for is my actions and my family's during World War II. I was born in Ilfracombe in 1921, and I was the youngest of 6 Burfitt children, and all of us took part in the war effort for World War II. Now, my opportunity came when I signed up in 1939 to join the Women's Land Army, and I got to receive excellent tutelage by the Miss Hartnell, more people than I've seen in a long time here. I got to receive excellent tutelage by Miss Hartnell, who was the instructress at Paul for the Devon Women's Land Army, and I got to learn about milking from an Ilfracombe farmer, and he taught me everything, and he said I learnt very quickly. He was happy with my progress. And when I became proficient, they asked me to take up a place on Lundy Island. Now, the thing about this was I was going to be the only land girl on Lundy Island. So the news got a bit interested, and the Western Morning News wrote an article about me, calling me England's loneliest land girl. It wasn't really that bad. I'd been led to believe that I was going to be living with an elderly couple, but thankfully they were quite closer to my age. It was a young Welshman and his 22-year-old wife. So I was in good company, and we didn't have lots of people on the island. We had less than you. We actually only had about 20 of us on the island. But we all gathered together several nights a week at the Morisco Tavern. And there we played games like darts and table skittles, and we listened to the radio. And I'd said to the Western Morning News before I went to the island, I'd said that I'm a land girl. I'm not worried about amusements. I don't care for the pictures. It's like, give me a novel and put me by a wireless and I'll be content. And thankfully, after 7 weeks anyway, they sent me a friend, so it wasn't that remarkable at all. But I got to swim off Lundy, and I got to plough the fields, and sorry, it's a lot to take in. They wrote a second article about me, that's what I was getting to. And this one, I was a bit less happy with the title. They said, WLA girl misses the hairdresser. Now, there was far more important stuff going on in the war than the hairdressers. And I told them anyway. I'd missed it for a few weeks, and then I'd had my hair chopped off. So it wasn't really a problem. We had far more to be doing there. We had 20 cows to milk twice a day. We had to clean out the cow sheds and lay down new hay. We had pigs to feed, oats to crush, 2 carts of kale to wheel out to the fields for the cows in pasture, and then more kale to chop up for the ones that lay in at night. There was loads to do. I wasn't worried about my hair. Then anyway, after my stint on Lundy, I went on to be a mechanic in the war, just like our princess at the time, Elizabeth. And I'd learnt mechanics from my dad, who ran a mechanics here in Ilfracombe. But all my siblings were going through far tougher times. My older sister Dorothy was a nurse with the West African forces. My brother Fred was wounded in 1942 and ended up coming home. My brother John Henry, unfortunately, was killed he was serving as a gunner on a ship, and he was unfortunately killed in 1944. And then my other brother, Lewis, probably had the worst time of all, as he was held as a prisoner of war in a Japanese internment camp and wasn't actually liberated until 2 days after VJ Day in 1945, when 7 American troops from what you'd now know as the CIA parachuted in and managed to liberate 14,000 men. 1,400, sorry, I made that sound a bit more dramatic. So really, me swimming off Lundy and ploughing some fields and tending to some cows wasn't the worst of what was going on, and it felt quite unfair to be the sibling getting all the attention. But that's all there is to know about me, really. You've got people who did far more to go and see. Has anyone's got any questions?
That was wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for coming and giving me the chance to talk about my family. My name is Elizabeth Knill, and I married Isaac Knill in this very church in 1870. Isaac was an Ilfracombe boy, born and bred, and I was so excited to come here and set up home with him by the sea. Our first home was up in Berkeley Place. We didn't have a view of the sea, but we could hear the seagulls. And there weren't many seagulls in Marwood, where I was from. In the early years of our marriage, we used to love going down and taking a stroll along the pier. It was always bustling with people coming off the steamers. some of them looking a bit seasick. We could never stay very long though, because Isaac had a job to go to. Isaac was a lamplighter, and it was a very important job. I always made sure he had a warm tea inside him before he set off to light up the streets of Ilfracombe. Now we had a big family. The Lord blessed us with 10 children in the space of 13 years. I know I don't look it, do I? Our firstborn was Annie. And after Annie, and you'll forgive me if I get the order wrong, we had William, Louis, Lucy, Joshua, Isaac, John, Charles, George and Philip. Sometimes we argued about the names, but... Now Philip was born in the February of 1885, and that was the last happy event in what was a tragic year for us. Not even 2 months later in April, I lost Isaac to consumption, and I was left a widow with 10 children to bring up on my own. Then in August of the same year, we lost our little Charlie, who was only 3 years old, and he came to rest here with his father. I can tell you that those were hard times. I didn't really know how I was going to cope, but I had to keep on going for the sake of those other chills. Annie and Lucy were 13 and 8 at the time, and their help to me in the home was precious. I got work too. I was a laundress at one point, and what with all the people coming down on the railways to stay in the big hotels around here, there was no shortage of work there. Well then of course the war came along in 1914, and that was a difficult time for everybody. By the end of it, I had waved off all 7 of my sons and 3 of my grandsons to war. The grandsons were all Louis' boys. Now you could have knocked me down in a feather in 1915 when I received a letter. Now that letter, I have read it so many times and I've read it out so many times, I know it almost off by heart. Dear Madam, it said, I have the honour to inform you that the King has heard with much interest that you have at present 5 sons in the Army and Navy. I am commanded to express to you the King's congratulations and to assure you that His Majesty much appreciates the spirit of patriotism which prompted this example in one family of loyalty and devotion to their sovereign and empire. It was signed, I have the honour to be, Madam, your obedient servant, F.M. Russell, Keeper of the Privy Purse. I wasn't too sure what that Privy Purse was all about, but anyway, that was the first of 2 acknowledgements that I received on behalf of my boys for their service to our country. Now I can tell you that that letter caused a bit of a stir. It was printed in the local paper, and I couldn't get my shopping done down Ilfracombe High Street for everybody stopping me because they wanted to talk about it. I didn't mind though. And my boys were so pleased as well. And I knew that my Isaac would have been bursting with pride. My boy John wrote to me from his posting abroad. He was so happy to hear about it. His other bit of news was that he'd been up to the front. I'm glad I didn't know about it when it was happening. But when he was coming back from the front, they came across a regiment of the Devons, and there were 2 Braunton boys amongst them. They just had time to shake hands, but it warmed my heart that my boy John met a little corner of Devon over there on a road in France. Well, the war took its toll, of course, and our family was no exception. I lost my boy Isaac, who drowned in the North Sea, a mine explosion. And then Louis' son, Isaac, another Isaac, he died in the Battle of the Somme The two of them are remembered here. You know, there were some times where I'd feel a bit guilty, because I'd find myself wishing that I'd only ever had girls and then they wouldn't have had to go. But then I would give myself a good old telling off, because I think to myself, my boys are over there fighting for us, and Louis's other son Charles even got a military medal for bravery. So that was a good example to me and to everybody else. Well, I've been visiting this grave now for nigh on 35 years. And when the good Lord chooses, I'll be buried here next to Isaac. But if I'm to believe a fortune teller who read my palm at Barnstable Fair, it won't be for a while yet. I'd like to thank you for letting me share my memories with you. And I wish you all a very pleasant afternoon.
I won't say good evening now, but I will say good evening in a couple of seconds. So, good evening everybody.
Evening.
My name is Thomas Blood. A lot of us spoke local name. At least a lot of us spoke in 1903, which is when my story started. Now, 1903. Now that were although old vicar is to say, at January 1st, she said it's not this year 1903, it's this year of grace 1903. In 1903, I suppose England were getting back on its feet after the World War, or Boer War. I suppose we were getting used to having a king on our throne. And I were not getting back on my feet, but back on my backside, and I were rowing a boat from Hillsborough there into the harbour when I found the body of a young girl, young woman, her were in about 3 foot of water. So I got help and we got her out. She was dead, of course. Smartly dressed young lady she was. She had a watch and a chain. Now that watch struck around about just after 9:15. Well, we searched her as discreetly and decently as we could. We found there was a card that said that she was staying at Diane Macaulay's guest house. Now I know Diane Macaulay, she's at 8-7 High Street. So we sent word to the police and we sent word to Diane Macaulay. Now, it must have been a day for bodies. And it was noon at the time. A short time later, Daniel Lovering, he found another body. This was a man. He was smartly dressed, moustache. Well, we got him out. And we found he got 2 watches. Now one had stopped at 10:15, the other had stopped at 11:15. And then, surprise, surprise, we found that he were a policeman. Policeman with 2 watches. I shouldn't be flippant, but it dropped in my mind. And the song that was going around in musicals at the time. If you want to know the time, ask a policeman. Rupper Granny's time, ask a policeman. Well, that policeman would have given you 2 choices, wouldn't you? So if he was late for work, he said, well, I asked that policeman, he looked at both of his watches. Well, now this is where it gets slightly sort of murky, because it appears that the policemen were in fact a detective called Detective Cherry. And about 2 hours later on, the whole town knew that Detective Cherry and the lady I found, his name was Miss Thorne. Both of them came from Hull, and both had been living as man and wife in Diane Macaulay's guest house. Well, and wife. Now, you see, she said, I'm a colleague, she made me laugh. She said, well, they didn't become overly fond of each other. They were miserable at each other. So I assumed they were newlyweds. Now, this is where it gets slightly murky. Both of them came from the town of Harbour in Yorkshire. Now, she, Miss Thorne, this is where it goes, she told her mother that she was going to stay with her sisters in Leeds for a couple of weeks. She told the sister in Leeds that she was going to be staying with her mother. Now, how police, they said that Detective Cherry told her he was taking his family down to Devon. Now, Detective Cherry, told his wife that he was going to Hamburg in Germany to apprehend a criminal. I reckon he got on the wrong train. Or, you know, well, perhaps he took the wrong turning at Tiverton, but anyway, they were there. And so they were going to be a fear that her were best friends with Mrs. Cherry, but they wouldn't have been best friends after that. So, on the day before, they had told Mrs. Macaulay, they said, look, if you've got any paper, I want to write a letter. So she gave them paper to write a letter. And then later on they said, well, we're going to have a last look at Hillsborough. And off they went. Now, later on, they hadn't returned at all. So Diane Macaulay, she notified the police force. Now, she had also, Mrs. Thorne, she had taken out £25 from her bank account. Now, £25, a lot of money, tiny sum. In those days, £100 would have bought you a cottage. So she had taken out that. At that time, we got a lot of visitors that came across from Wales, and it was there were a regular boat service to and from Wales. See, and I was given a Welsh newspaper. And the Welsh newspaper had given the headlines that a couple had fallen off the cliffs at Hillsborough. Now, at the inquest, it appeared that she had a heart problem. You know, there's a very odd thing here. That she had told everybody that she was going out for a walk to Hillsborough. Now, very odd thing. So, did they fall? Did she have a fall? Now, her watch had stopped a half hour before the policeman's. So he took a long time in diving off to save her, didn't he? So what had happened? Well, they did two things in those days. They said, if you fall off a cliff, I suppose there might be an act of God. If you took your own life, it was an act against God. So what had happened? Had he, with this half-hour difference, had he pushed her in? Had he dived in half hour later and thought, what have I done? And then drowned himself? Had they made a pact to go together? Because perhaps they couldn't face going home. Well, whatever happens, they were buried here. Now, their grave were never marked. They lowered him in, and they lowered her on top. Of course, the family were upset naturally. But why didn't the bodies return to the town of Hull, where the family could come out and pay their last respect? And they weren't. They were left here. So, was it, as Vicar said, this year of grace, or were it this year of disgrace? What do we think?
Good evening.
Evening.
My name's Ralph. I'm with the Graveyard Group. I regret to say that the real Captain Birmingham couldn't make it because he's lost his sea legs. So I've been conscripted to walk the plank today and tell you a tale of adventure on the high seas. In the captain's absence, I'll be reading a monologue written by another graveyard volunteer, which is Mark Parr. I also won't be trying out my West Country accent because I just sound like a pirate. Anyway, so Captain Thomas Birmingham. I was born in Ilfracombe and I've been a seafarer all my life. I was Ilfracombe's harbour master from 1905 until 1913. I first went to sea as an apprentice in 1854 on the bark Coronella. Does anybody know what a bark is? So they're described as any seagoing vessel that's got more than 3 masts, and the rigging is configured in a special way which allows you to set sail with fewer crew. On the bark Coronella during the Crimean War. I was promoted to second mate at the age of 20 and became only mate 4 years later. I obtained my mastership in 1865 at the age of 26. A mastership is the Merchant Navy equivalent to the Royal Navy Captain, so hence the Captain Birmingham. I surely had some narrow escapes, but my most harrowing trips were around the Cape Horn at the bottom of the world. The dangers of the winds, waves, current and icebergs between South America and Antarctica are legendary. Those trips made me a respected Cape Horner. Those of us who rounded the Horn were entitled to wear a gold looped earring in our left ear, which would be the ear facing the Horn on an eastbound passage. We were also entitled to put one leg up on the table, although Mrs. Birmingham wasn't very keen on that. In 1877, I captained the bark Esperanza from Swansea to Newfoundland with a load of Welsh coal, returning to Swansea with a cargo of copper ore. Out in the mid-Atlantic, we were thrashed by heavy seas and lost our sails. My crew tossed the cargo overboard, but the bark took on water and laboured heavily. I put the Esperanza before the wind for 10 days until we were rescued by the Westminster, which was sailing from Liverpool to Quebec. We did everything we could to save the ship, but in the end had to abandon the vessel. I was charged with abandonment and my master's certificate revoked. However, a Swansea Board Trade of Inquiry determined, and I quote this, "It would have been a foolhardy act of rashness if the captain had not acted as he did in saving the lives of his crew." I was absolved and my master's certificate returned without stain or blame. In 1887, we had a narrow escape with a fire aboard the bark Minstrel Boy. We discovered a fire in the hold and got the general cargo up on deck. We got all the way down to the coals, which we found were on fire. We could scarcely work there for smoke and gas, but it was neck or nothing with us. A fire is never a good thing in the first place, but we had a ton of gunpowder on board, and right over the seat of the fire were stowed 100 cases of spirits, and on top of that 130 barrels of sulphur. There were 6 large cases of sulphuric acid on deck, so between the lot I was almost driven to my wits' end. When such things happen at sea, there is not much time for a sailor to think, as he must act, or he will soon find himself going skywards hanging to the mizzenmast, or most likely blown to small pieces. We let 2 feet of water into the ship, then got the main pumps underway. We cut holes in the deck, let the hoses down through them right onto the fire, which we finally subdued after 4 days of heavy labour. Of course, I need not tell you that the gunpowder went overboard in double quick time. So I suppose you may say we laid a train of gunpowder in the South Atlantic ready for the 5th of November. We arrived in St Helens safely, but it was a very narrow squeak, as I don't suppose you could have found another cargo such as ours afloat. I was often at sea for months at a time, and Mrs Birmingham never knew when or if she would see me again. I gave her a start when I made an unscheduled stop in Ilfracombe in 1897. About 5 weeks earlier, we had sailed the Aberlemno from Glasgow for Rio de Janeiro with a cargo of coal. In the Irish Sea, the ship was caught in a succession of gales which took the sails one by one. After being blown about in the Atlantic for 19 days, we ran for the Bristol Channel and made for Penarth in Wales. There we refitted her with new sails and started again with a northeasterly wind. Shortly after midnight, we were caught in a snow squall when the wind veered to the north and drove us ashore near Kumata. We were spotted by a Kumartin Coast Guard who fired rockets at 3 in the morning. The Ilfracombe lifeboat was launched, but they had to creep along the coast in snow and darkness until they discovered our vessel stranded on the rocks near Watermouth Cove, which you know is just down there. With great difficulty, the lifeboat got alongside and the Coast Guard men came aboard. They stayed with the ship until daylight, but were unable to get her off the rocks. Despite the danger of sinking, I refused to leave the ship and the crew stayed with me. Suddenly, about 7 AM, the ship turned and glided off the rocks, still afloat. We raised the sails and were brought safely into Ilfracombe Harbour with only minor damage. As happy as Mrs Birmingham was to see me, she tried to persuade me that this was one disaster too many, and she was very pleased when I was appointed Deputy Harbour Master at Ilfracombe under Captain Dennis a year later. I took over as Harbour Master in 1905 when the pier and harbour were purchased by the Ilfracombe Urban District Council. Back then the pier was a very busy place, with 6 or 7 steamers arriving every day. I resigned in 1913 due to my failing health, and I passed away at my residence in Ilfracombe at the age of 77 in 1916. I am very lucky my family has remembered me, along with my wife Susanna and our daughter Minnie in the graveyard, especially my great-granddaughter Margaret, who travels regularly from Plymouth to tend my grave. Thank you very much. Any questions? I don't know the answers.
Well, we can find out. We know a man who's very good at doing these.
Well, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not local. I come from Cardiff. My name is Hannah Phillips, but you'll have my name as Escort Robert, because of course the man is the most important one, and he's my lovely husband. And he's also from Cardiff, but we met here. We were married here. Not uncommon in those days to come across the water for work in this lovely place of Ilfracombe, where everyone wanted to be and come on holiday. So we had a daughter, Alice, who, when I died at the age of, when she was 20, I beg your pardon, when I died in 1911. But we lived in Cardiff, just across here, the village gate, 23 West Bourne Road, and I ran that as a boarding house. Because if you had a room in those days, you'd let it because somebody wanted to be there, because Ilfracombe was such a popular place. Now, I'm not here to talk about my life, strangely enough. I'm here to tell you about the effects of my death in 1911 on my family. So if you will beg my pardon, I will read to you from my daughter's journal. Alice, at the age of 20, started writing a journal after I died. shall read it in her lovely reading voice. She was not too far. As an only child, I felt responsible for taking care of my farm after losing my mother from tuberculosis. Dad was always so good to me. Since I was very small, I looked up to him. He'd once worked in the Royal Clarence Hotel in Ilfracombe. Dad and I both missed Mum terribly. Without her, our home was icy cold and lonely, empty. So after receiving a letter from our Uncle William, Daddy's brother, in America, we decided to take his advice and join him and his family there. A factory foreman's job position waited for my father in New Brighton, Pennsylvania. We sold our home and purchased tickets aboard the steamship Philadelphia. But due to a national coal strike, our passage had been transferred to the Royal Mail ship Titanic. Ticket number 2, £21. My mind swelled with dreams of grandeur because we'd be among the first passengers to set sail on this brand new ship. On the morning of April the 9th, we took a 9-hour train ride from Ilfracombe railway station to Southampton. At our hotel there, I wrote to grandmother, describing the ocean liner docked at berth 44. Dad and I have been to look at the Titanic. It is a monstrous great boat, higher than the Royal Clarence Hotel. I cannot tell you how long it is. We are going to embark tomorrow after breakfast. When morning peered through the gap in our drawn curtains, I quickly dressed and I was ready for my first ocean voyage. As we stepped inside the grand ship, I could not believe my eyes. It's like a magical fairy tale house, and better than I could ever imagine. A cabin steward led us to an elevator and then to our separate rooms. I shared cabin D17 with 3 travellers from St Ives in Cornwall. Mrs Agnes Davies, a young son John, and a girl about my age called Maud Sinnott. Our second class rooms had 4 bunk beds, freshly painted white walls, a polished mahogany dresser and a wash basin. It was all like a fantastic dream. As I put my things away in the closet, I glanced up and smiled at my reflection in the glassy mirror. Titanic set sail at noon and a flutter in my tummy had quietened down. It had been 20 years since Dad had seen his brother, and he was looking forward to their happy reunion. Uncle William and my Aunt Bessie had a daughter, Isabel, who's about 2 years younger than I. I'd only known them from photographs and letters, so I was really looking forward to meeting them. At lunchtime, we headed for the dining saloon. The long room was elegant with oak panels, rows of mahogany tables and swivel chairs with fancy crimson upholstery. And at the far end of the dining room was a piano. The couple who spent time with us at our table had 2 lovely daughters, and we all chatted together in such a friendly manner. After our meal, Dad and I were anxious to explore the ship. We climbed the stairs and took a leisurely stroll along the sun deck, counting the covered lifeboats hanging from their davits. Father grew sleepy, so while he relaxed on deck to enjoy the ocean view on a deck chair, I joined in deck games, shuffleboard and ring toss, and then after dinner I played a game of backgammon in the library. Dad retreated to the smoking room with some of the other men. Our days at sea were passing so quickly. I hardly wanted them to end, but I knew they must. Then, on Sunday night, April the 14th, as I lay awake in bed, a tremendous shock gave me a start. Desperately frightened, I rushed into the corridor with Mrs Davies. Our cabin steward assured us there was nothing to be alarmed about. I was not convinced. Something felt amiss. Dad came by our room and I accompanied him to the open deck. There we stood back and watched as the sailors drew the tops off the lifeboats. One of the crew shouted, "All on deck with lifebelts on." I hurried below to alert my cabin companions. With our life jackets on, Dad and I hurried to the upper deck. I shivered from the cold because in my haste I'd forgotten my coat. An officer called, "Women and children first." Father walked me over to the lifeboat on the port side. He kissed me on the cheek and helped me into the boat and said, "Don't worry, I'll join you later." The small boat lurched towards the sea. Once on the water, sailors took to the oars and pulled away from the ship. Then came what sounded like an explosion. I watched in disbelief as the Titanic dove into the ocean. Those left aboard were tossed into the icy sea. I could never forget their cries for help. It was awful. And to know my dear father suffered such a tragedy was too terrible to even think of. I almost felt I would like to have died with him. The monstrous ship, as high as the Royal Clarence Hotel, was no more. Our boat drifted along in the calm sea. Nary a ripple. Thousands upon thousands of stars shone bright. And in the bone-chilling night, we nearly froze to death. Then, in mid-ocean, several of the lifeboats were tied together to help us to be more visible to the rescue ship. With room on our boat, we took on more passengers than the ones that were overcrowded. Before the sun rose and the dark began to slip away, I glanced around at the pale ghost-like faces of those who'd survived this dreadful night. How much longer? We survived. How long did any of us last? Was there a ship coming? Then a sharp sound of a whistle grabbed our attention. Across the waves we spotted an upside-down life raft and rowed toward her. Standing on top of the boat were men, some looking near collapse. The survivors were assisted into our lifeboats, and still holding on to hope, I searched for my father's face. When I realised that it wasn't there, I cried. Then blue lights appeared in the sky, rockets. A ship came into view. At last we're saved. The rescue ship, the RMS Carpathia, arrived in New York on Thursday morning. With the other survivors, I made my way down the gangplank. Somewhere from within the enormous crowd, I heard my name called. A man waved his arms above his head. "Alice! Alice!" I recognised him from an old photograph. "Uncle William!" He approached me, and I dissolved into tears. "Dad is gone. I'm afraid I shall never see him again." I collapsed into his arms and sobbed. After the shipwreck, I became seriously ill. Once my health had returned, I was trained as a stenographer and worked in my uncle's company. And although I appreciated his family's generosity and their kindness, I felt horribly lonesome for home and my grandmother and relatives in England. So, 9 months after Dad and I had left Southampton together, I returned back on the Baltic to Liverpool at 8. And I can tell you now, Grandmother was delighted, overjoyed to have her Alice back again, as you can imagine. Thank you.